which is an investor in early stage companies. We invest in hardware, software, and life science companies, and we invest at all stages from, I've got an idea and I need some help figuring out how to get it off the ground, to we have revenues, we've raised funds, we're now out to raise our next Series A, $10 million, we've got a lead investor, and can you guys come in for a couple million? So we'll tell you a little bit more about InnovationWorks later, but maybe we should introduce ourselves first. So Matt, do you want to start with that? And what we're going to be talking about is physical product companies and strategies for making products locally and internationally, and how to decide which makes sense for your business.
Right. So my name is Matt Verlinich. I just joined InnovationWorks recently as their manufacturing program associate. So I head up all of the manufacturing initiatives, as well as advising our portfolio companies on connecting them hopefully with the appropriate manufacturing resource, ideally locally, but whatever it takes to get the job done. My background is that I was the founding general manager of Tech Shop here in Pittsburgh. So I started and ran that business for 3 years, and then ultimately left to develop my own physical product company, which is an ice mold that makes perfectly clear ice cubes. So it's a fairly straightforward product, but it allowed me to have the opportunity to go through every stage from ideation to prototype to mass production to international distribution. And so after running that for a few years, I was fortunate enough to join the InnovationWorks team, and now I get to help other people step through that same process.
And Matt is still running that business, right?
Yes, I still run that on the side, and it's going great.
Okay, and I'm Ilana Diamond. InnovationWorks is the most active seed stage investor in the country right now, even though we invest exclusively in Pennsylvania. And as I mentioned, we invest in 3 categories, one of which is physical products, and I run that group. So from the various earliest stages, we have an accelerator called AlphaLab Gear, where we invest in companies, give them space, give them mentorship, give them programming, and help them build their company, through the next stage, which is our seed stage fund, where we invest in companies and still make connections for them and help them. And then through our Riverfront Ventures fund, I'm also a managing director there, where it's a Series A fund. We can invest up to $2 million-ish, and we do it together with other outside VCs. About 75% of all companies that get funding in Pennsylvania come through one of our programs first. And so we're really excited to talk to people who have ideas for physical product companies and for software companies as well, and we're happy to connect you to those folks. What I did before InnovationWorks was I ran an international consumer electronics company called SEMA Products. You might have heard of some of our brands: First Alert, emergency alerting products, MGM Studios, it was our home theater accessory brand, Cherokee Electronics, which was mobile electronics, and then we did under our private label and our customers' private labels, we did a whole range of audio video accessories. We sold to people like Best Buy and Walmart and Target and Amazon. We sold to many large companies like Bose. We would make private label products for them. And then we also sold through catalogs and through distribution, you know, to custom installers who come to your house and put in a whole home theater. So my business, the First Alert business, had this idea for a commercial alerting product when we were about 15 years old, when the company was about 15 years old. Unlike all of our other products, which were consumer products, and we sold them through retailers and other methods of distribution, this was a product that had to be installed directly with the customer. It required 24/7 maintenance. It required installation. And it was just a totally different model, and we decided that we should spin it off into a separate company. And InnovationWorks, that's how I met them. They were the first money in. So they put in money from their seed fund. I think they even might have put in some money early for us to explore whether it made sense as a spin-off, like a grant. Then they put money in from the seed fund. We eventually went out and raised money from several institutional VCs, and they came in on that round as well. And you may have seen that product around CMU, because CMU is actually a customer for that company. It's called Metasecure Solutions. And if you've seen those sort of triangular emergency alerting devices on the wall or the yellow boxes outside that you can call for help, like in the parking lots. That is that company. So about 5 years, 5, 6, 7 years ago, we sold both of those companies within a 12-month period. And when we sold the second one, InnovationWorks said, you know, we're thinking about taking our software accelerator model and testing it for physical product companies. Would you like to help us? And I was fortunate enough to join at that time. And I was the founding managing director of AlphaLab Gear. And now I'm working with all the different investment groups at InnovationWorks. So we're excited to be here. And do you want to lead us off on this?
Yeah.
We're going to talk about physical product companies and how they used to be and how they are today, and if you have an idea for one, what kinds of things you can be thinking about. So, oops, sorry.
No, that's
Hardware
all right.
used to be hard and complicated.
Yes. So this image kind of just shows a very high-tech, very clean fabrication facility, which is what a lot of people think of whenever they think of hardware. And as a result of that, venture capital firms used to just boot any hardware startup right out the door because it doesn't fit the model, it's too slow, it's too expensive, it's too risky. But things have been changing. So here's a bunch of different articles about how and why VCs are starting to really take interest in physical product companies.
So it used to be that they were really excited about the fact that with $25,000 and a computer and 2 people, you could build a software startup. But they didn't perceive hardware startups as being as capital efficient and as quick to get to a product. So, you know, now that is all changing.
Yes.
Oops.
So that has changed significantly in the last several years. And actually, I find it interesting because when I first started at Tech Shop, that was right around the exact time that AlphaLab Gear was starting. And so Ilana and I worked together from the earliest days at AlphaLab Gear, but I was on the Tech Shop side, and now we get to work together. But in between, I came to Ilana with my idea, and she helped me talk through it, and there wasn't really much of a fit with InnovationWorks because it wasn't a deep tech product, it wasn't a huge market, it was more of a lifestyle brand, but it was still, InnovationWorks is a great resource for that, and in part because of this type of model that we try to encourage anybody to pursue whenever pushing forward with a hardware-related product. And that is, first and foremost, is always customer validation. You have to do whatever it takes to get customer validation before you invest anything, because as with any business, it's a risky investment, and so you need to de-risk that more than ever because those initial investments in a physical product company are significantly higher than a software product company. And progressing on to product market fit, team building, and eventually then getting the investor buy-in, which is essentially where people start whenever they approach IW, is they look at us as an investor and they come and say, hey, can you give us money for this idea yet?
So what, you know, this model is sort of old school for software. It's been around for 15, 20 years. This is how software companies, you know, got going quickly, were capital efficient. You know, they would build an early stage prototype, they'd get it into customers' hands, they'd get feedback, they'd iterate. But it didn't really work for hardware companies, right? And the reason it didn't work was, number one, people didn't have access to tools for prototyping until you showed up with Tech Shop, right? So if you wanted to make a prototype and put it in someone's hand and you were making something physical, it wasn't like building a software product, right?
Right.
So.
And nowadays, and that was 2013 that Tech Shop showed up here. So it still blows my mind now that that was 6 years ago. And things are continuing to change. Now there's several maker spaces on CMU's campus, which you guys all have access to. So there's plenty of different ways to do that. And
I just want to say that if you have not seen, if you've got a physical product idea and you haven't seen the prototyping facilities that are over next to Wayne Hall.
Hammerschlag?
Yeah.
the
It
Tech
is.
Spark, I think it's called.
Yeah, it's truly amazing. It makes what Tech Shop had look, I don't know,
Childish.
childish. Exactly. That's the right word.
Amateur.
Yeah, I mean, it's truly amazing. We were drooling when we were over there.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
can thank ANSYS for that.
Yeah. The interesting thing is, I think you guys had $3 million of equipment when you originally put it in.
Yeah, if you included software, it was like 1 to 2 million. But at the end of the day, fake it till you make it. And that is something that does not come naturally to a lot of people, especially when they think about hardware products, that there is so much that you can accomplish without a finished looking saleable product. And some of the terminology that we use is works like prototype, looks like prototypes, and then minimum viable product. So they're all different things, and you can use them for very specific purposes, and you should use them for very specific purposes as quickly as possible.
So I just want to say something about exactly what you said, works like versus looks like. Looks like, it can look beautiful, there's probably nothing inside it, right? And works like, it might look really ugly, but it actually works. And what you'll find is, if you're trying to sell to retailers like a Best Buy or Walmart, very often those folks, they are not engineers. You can bring in something that is extremely difficult to build, extremely difficult to make work, but it doesn't look beautiful and they won't believe it works. Whereas, you can bring in something that looks gorgeous and it has metal weights inside and you could never turn it on, it's nowhere near working. And they'll be more likely to believe you that you're close to where you need to be and be willing to place an order for it. And so I think the key is really understanding who your audience is and understanding when to use each of these. If you take a works-like model to an engineer, you're not fooling them at all. But if you take a works-like model to someone who really doesn't understand how difficult it was to build it and thinks that what's difficult is the outer shell, again, you're going to have trouble getting them to sign on the dotted line. So you kind of need both of these on your way to building a minimum viable product. And when we say minimum viable product, we mean the first product that you can ship to customers that they're going to be willing to pay you for. It solves their problem enough. It's not great, but it solves their problem enough that they're going to be willing to pay you for it. And the way we tell people to determine whether they have that or not is when you put these early stage prototypes in people's hands and you get their feedback, and now you say, okay, give it back to me, we're going to update it. They say, no. You can't take this back from me. I need this. When somebody says that to you, you've got your minimum viable product.
Absolutely. And I've seen the definitions of this and the customer segments that you have potential access to change tremendously over the last 10 years or even the last 6 years just since Tech Shop opened. And that's largely thanks to crowdfunding, which we will talk a little bit more about later. But the looks like prototype might not even be something physical. A lot of times that you'll see on, especially on crowdfunding campaigns, they're just renderings. And people will still buy into it if you have the right pitch. And those type of people who will buy into that are becoming a larger and larger segment of your customers out there because people are comfortable with the idea of prepaying for something and buying into you and your credibility on being able to deliver. Yeah, so here's some other great examples of this point too, where you can start your product, like Ilana was saying, with a minimum viable product. Something that you might have dozens and dozens of features that you want to pack into this one little product, but people can and will buy it with just one. And so identifying those priorities and starting as quickly as possible, getting yourself a toehold, building that credibility, makes it a lot easier for you to then launch subsequent products and iterations and versions. And part of that is because it's extremely difficult to have a successful launch, and a huge portion of that comes in the upfront work that goes into that. So trying to build an audience and get customer traction and feedback before you have anything, credibility, prototype, anything, that is where the biggest part of your work is going to come in. And from that point forward, it'll start slow, and then it will grow from there. So the more quickly you can get something into a customer's hand, out of your head, and into the physical world, the better.
Yeah, I will say that if you're comfortable with what you're giving to customers, it's too late. You need to be like, we have to pry it out of your hand. You have to feel like people are prying it out of your hand to get it to customers, because you can spend an awful lot of time building features nobody cares about. And you won't know that until you put it in people's hands. We've worked with a lot of CMU people. We have, I'm not going to name names here, but if people want somebody to talk to, if they're wondering if it's the right time to put their product into someone's hands, we're happy to have you talk to some of the folks we've worked with who will say, I fought and fought and fought you guys, but I now think it was even too late by the time I put it in customers' hands, because they spent a lot of time and money and effort on features that it turned out they ended up not putting in the final product because nobody cared about it. And the main feature that got people excited was something they hadn't built out yet. So you want to learn that early. With regard to crowdfunding, we've done a lot of crowdfunding campaigns with our companies. We work closely with IndieGoGo and the folks at Kickstarter. And some of the things that we've learned is the key to a successful crowdfunding campaign all happens before the launch. If you don't have it all set before the launch, it's too late. And I'm not going to say that there's no one who put something out there with very little thought, and there may be people who succeeded like that. But the vast majority of people who succeeded had nailed down half or more, almost all of their total raise, before they ever put that video up online, before they launched that campaign. And that way, they launch the campaign and, they fulfill half, three-quarters, or all of their raise in the first day. Why is that important? Because places like Kickstarter and IndieGoGo have to decide who's going to be on their front page, on their home page, right? And if you get to be on their home page, that's a big boost to your traffic and to your campaign. And the way they decide it is people who fully raised their round or who are really close. What they kept telling us is a half-full Kickstarter campaign is not a story. And it's not a story to the people at Kickstarter, IndieGoGo. It's not a story to the press. Everybody wants to back a winner. And the other thing that we found is very important to remember is your competitors are watching. If you have big competitors, you may find all of a sudden that they do some of the things that you're talking about. So you do want to think about what you say, in that campaign.
Absolutely. And to elaborate on that a bit more too, I think it's very good to keep in mind that Kickstarter and IndieGoGo are businesses, and they have to make money off of the projects that they work with. And so if they're going to give you any additional traffic or boost, it's because it's going to benefit them. And so more and more what I've been seeing is that, especially IndieGoGo, they are becoming very, very data driven. So they know every single piece of data that goes into and out of your campaign. They know your conversion rates, your traffic rates, how much of the traffic you're driving versus how much is coming organically. They know what type of people are buying that, and then they can segment it out and send it to different portions of their audience, which is continuously growing day over day, month over month. So they're going to back the projects that they think will be winners for the audience that they have. A crowdfunding campaign is not right for everybody, and it's not right for every project. Ultimately, you have to look at the type of projects that are going on there and see if that is a fit for your product, your customer, at the end of the day. Otherwise, you're just going to be giving Kickstarter and IndieGoGo 5% to run a pre-launch campaign where you drive all the traffic. So.
And I think that's a really good point, that Kickstarter and IndieGoGo have very different audiences. And they're pretty straightforward about that. Mm-hmm. And you can tell it pretty easily, too, by going online. You can go online, you can check people who have audiences similar to yours. You can see, how many of them got funded well, how much traction they got. The other thing that I'll say along the lines of what Matt said is IndieGoGo and Kickstarter are very data-driven, but they're still run by people. And so if you reach out to us, we're happy to connect you to the people who run each of those segments. Mm-hmm. If the person who runs, let's say, beauty products at IndieGoGo, if you develop a relationship with that person and they care about you, you're going to get support. You're going to get them talking about you in their internal meetings. You can get all kinds of things that will help your campaign, sort of an unfair advantage. So it's really important. That's part of the success before the launch. It's really important to reach out to them, ask for their advice, stay in touch with them, and build a relationship there.
Absolutely. So you can use Kickstarter and IndieGoGo as customer discovery, product research, You can try to figure out what your other competition is doing on there, but other ways that you can do supply chain hacks when it comes to actually making your product. You can cobble it together from resources that are already out there being mass produced. People who have already sunk the money in to make the tooling, and this is using like Alibaba and other types of like, oh crap, I can't remember. But like electronic enclosures is probably the #1 thing that we see amongst the companies that we work with, people wanting to make a custom electronics enclosure. And it's not necessary for a works-like prototype. And there's tons and tons of companies out there that sell stock electronic enclosure boxes that you can buy for pennies on the dollar and just get your prototype working before ever having to worry about the industrial design of it.
The other thing you can do, and that's what shop outside the box means, is you can go to Walmart and you can find things that use some of the same components as you have. If they're selling for $10 at Walmart, somebody is making it for $1 somewhere. So it can be cheaper to just go there and take product apart and sort of steal some of the components and reuse them. And you can have a looks like and works like kind of prototype less expensively than designing everything yourself. The other thing that I think is really important is riding the volume of high volume products. So if you're thinking about a screen for your product, think in terms of other products that they make millions and millions of that have a similar size screen. Maybe it won't be ideal for your product, but for the minimum viable product, it doesn't matter. And the example I always think of is we were doing an emergency alerting product, and our engineer had designed this very cool size screen, custom. We were going to tool it and all of that. And then somebody's not that far off from a mobile phone screen. And we went out and just sourced mobile phone screens, and they were 1/50th the price because people were making millions and millions and millions of them. Okay, it wasn't the perfect size. We had to add a little piece in our tool around the edge to make it fit. But it was so much cheaper, it was worth it. So I'd highly encourage you to get out of CMU, go out to these retailers, Target and Walmart and places like that, shop for things that are inexpensive and take them apart, and then you know what components are being made in the millions, and you can sort of ride that high volume coattail, because whenever you make something custom, you not only pay for the tooling, which can be anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000, but you also have to pay for the low volume production. And low volume production is way, way, way more expensive than high volume. In fact, what we used to say, at least in electronics, was when you increase your volume by a factor of 10, you cut the cost by 1/3. So.
Yeah.
Oh, one other thing, never ever be the guinea pig with any factory. You will get a lot of, especially overseas factories, they want to move into a new area, they hear you're from CMU, they want that new technology. Oh yes, we know how to do that, we want to do it. If they haven't done it, and they haven't done it for a while successfully, never start with them, especially if you're new. At my company, we had a rule, we would never choose a factory where we were the first one doing that type of product, or we had never worked with them before. They had to have one of those two things. Either we'd worked with them before and we understood their capabilities, or they had made millions of this type of product and we felt confident they could do it. Those two together are the kiss of death. Even when you have a company that's been around for 20 years, has a ton of successful products in the market, so you've got experienced engineers, and certainly for a startup, it's not the place to go.
Yeah, and that is a particularly common thing that you'll run to in overseas manufacturing, is that can-do attitude, which doesn't always work for you. So, interesting.
That's what I was just saying.
Yeah, thinking about, another thing to consider too is thinking about your factory and your supply chain as a partner. This is one of the standout benefits to working locally as opposed to overseas, is because you will be able to build a relationship with a factory locally much more easily and cost effectively without having to pay for trips back and forth. Plus, you don't have to fight cultural differences. And that can be a huge barrier depending on your background and experience and what your team is made up of.
I was going to say something about the small production runs. Regardless of what size order, you always want to do small production runs first. So let's say you're really fortunate and somebody wants 1 million of whatever your product is, and you decide, I'm going to make 100,000 to start on the first production run. Almost always something goes wrong, and you're going to eat those costs. So even, even in our company where we really did make millions for people like Walmart, we always ran a few hundred or a few thousand first, and then we'd build it up, then maybe 10,000, maybe then 100,000, because as you scale your production, different issues come into focus. When you only make a few thousand of something, it may go just fine, but once they get up and running and they make a much larger quantity, problems can crop up. And just remember that each time you increase the scale of your production run, the size of the problem increases too. It might seem like a small problem, but a small problem on 1,000 units, can really be a lot of money when you make 100,000 or 1 million units. And a small problem on 1,000 units where every single person calls you, after they bought it, that's one thing. But if 100,000 people call your helpline, that's a whole different story, right? So.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
And another thing to consider too is being able to have the relationship with your factory where you can fully understand their capabilities in their manufacturing process. Because if you have the intention of scaling up to 1 million, it might not be possible for that factory to put out that many units. There can be a lot of aspects of either the design for manufacture, the DFM, or the design for assembly that can make it just physically impossible for that. And so if you spend a lot of time working out the kinks on a smaller production run, and then you continue to scale up, you'll get those answers of, yeah, no problem, we can do it. And out of nowhere, you'll get very expensive problems.
Yes. And that's one reason why for the first production run, wherever it is, you need to be there in person with an engineer or production engineer, sitting there on the production line. Because remember also, once they've spent all the time and money building up the production line, they want to run it at full capacity. If there's a little something wrong, they may just continue to run it. You need to be there.
Yes.
Which gets us to our next point about why it might make sense in the beginning, at least, if not always, to design in the U.S.
Yes.
Manufacture in the U.S.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of factors that go into this aside from just actually the manufacturing engineering side of this right now. I'm sure everybody has heard of the trade talks that we are in right now with China and the tariffs that are potentially going to be there. That can increase your costs 25%, which is nothing to shake a stick at. So the costs here can actually be lower, and I would say more importantly, you can actually work through it more easily with the engineers at the factory chosen here locally, that they will be more likely to suggest a better alternative than what you were trying to design for, especially if you don't come from a really deep manufacturing engineering perspective. It's really difficult to get an understanding of every process that goes into your product.
So, when we say it can be lower cost, it's really all about the design for manufacture. So if you take a product that's being made in the millions in Asia, they've designed it to be manufactured with a lot of labor and not much, sort of advanced manufacturing in general. Not everywhere, but in general. And so when you're thinking about designing the product, if you think you're going to start in the U.S., you want to get your manufacturer involved early, and you want to design it for manufacturability here. And it really, we had a product that we sold to Walmart, and we sold literally millions of these, and we were buying them for $5 in Asia. And everybody thought that was exactly the kind of product that you could not make cost effectively in the U.S. But it really turned out that when our engineer, he was committed to this idea, actually a CMU engineer, he really believed that if he redesigned it, he could make it more cost effectively here in the U.S. and more reliably, because when we'd get these big orders, if we couldn't ship them on time, we were getting fined by our customers. So he redesigned the entire things. Instead of 3 small PC boards, it was one-sided PC board. Instead of 2 plastic pieces of the case that screwed together with 8 little hand screws, it was a snap fit, that could be done on the line. So it was, he redesigned the whole thing. It didn't look anything like it used to look, but you know what? When you took into account the inventory carrying costs, because if you have to hold 6 months of inventory so that you're not getting fined by your customers so you can ship on time, or if you've got quality control problems, or if you're worried about your IP, if you take all that into account, it was actually cheaper for us. So I think this is something to really think carefully about. This is what Matt does.
Yes.
Every day.
That is absolutely true. It's so easy. The biggest savings that you'll get with overseas manufacturing is on materials, because they have an economies of scale over there, which we can't touch. They just consume every raw material in such a greater degree that their supply chains are incredible, their bulk discounts are incredible, but that only goes so far. And then the cost of labor is much cheaper. And again, those prices are steadily rising in China right now, and it's not always the answer to your product problems, especially if you're going to make things in the millions. And their automation over there, when it comes to making parts at that scale, is not as effective as it is locally. So that is probably one of the biggest things. It's very easy to get sucked into just materials and labor of the cost, but there's so many other components to it when it comes to packaging, distribution, logistics of shipping back and forth, warehousing, taxes, quality control issues, wastage rates. There's so many things that it really helps to put and list all out on your bill of materials with some tolerances and figure it out. And it, like, maybe it is still, at the end of the day, more expensive to make it here, but in terms of your management time on those issues, you have to factor that in too. And if it comes down to a 10% difference in the early stages especially, that's not going to break your business, but one massive problem with any of the components along the way could. So we touched on all that. IP is probably the only other thing we didn't touch on yet. Intellectual property protection is problematic when crossing international borders. There are many ways around that by like segmenting your assembly into many different parts, making sure that you use different manufacturers for that, but that can introduce other complexities and problems into your situation that you may not have the bandwidth to deal with. And it is definitely easier to protect your intellectual property around here. The first time you go to try to get a product quoted in Asia, and you try to get a non-disclosure agreement, and they just kind of laugh at you, and it's just like, yeah, sure, we'll sign that. No worries. You'll get a sense for intellectual property. So, and yes, distribution, kind of what we were talking about. Distribution magnifies all of the issues, and it's something that is almost always an afterthought.
Yes. So as you get into bigger, you have small problems in small quantities. They can be dealt with. But once you really start distributing it, those problems can amplify. So we always say, price high to start. You can always come down. But you don't know the problems until they crop up. So you price high to start. Another thing that we recommend to people with physical products is do things that don't scale. So in the beginning, you really want to be learning from your customers. You want to be talking to everybody who's using your product. Obviously, when you make $1 million, you can't do that. But you don't have to think about that to start. At the very beginning, you want to be really close to your customer, really understanding things, really figuring out where things work and where they don't. And so you want to err on the cost side early, having more customer service, having more support, having more interactions with people who are using your product in the beginning. And then, I don't know what we meant by engineering software marketing hardware.
I wasn't sure either, actually.
Yeah. Sorry about that, guys.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, this is the biggest issue for physical product companies. Profit and cash are not the same thing, and I probably don't need to say that here at CMU, but you'd be surprised how many folks get confused between the difference between profit and cash. And so a growing hardware business is going to need way more cash than a growing software business. You're getting paid. People are not going to pay you the minute you ship your product, especially if your customers are big. You'll be lucky if you get paid 60, 90 days after you ship your product. But But you know what? Your manufacturer, they want to get paid before they ship to you. So you run into this problem with cash that could be anywhere from, I don't know, 30 days if you're lucky to 6 to 9 months if you're unlucky, where as you're growing and making more and more product and paying the people for it in advance, the people who are buying that product are paying you, 6 months after you shipped it. So physical product companies have to keep a really, really close handle on the cash, and that's why a lot of them are interested in getting venture investment. The one thing I will say is physical product companies have an avenue that traditionally software companies have not had to get cash, and that is a bank. So banks will lend you on your accounts receivable. They will lend you on your inventory. They might even lend you on your work in process inventory, so your components. Software companies, for the most part, have had a really hard time getting that kind of financing. But if anybody is thinking about these things, we are happy to make connections. We have a lot of folks who will do earlier stage physical product company bank financing at reasonable rates. But it's really important to watch this. When you're doing your revenue projections and your balance sheet projections, don't forget the cash flow statement.
Absolutely. And this can be a very good argument, again, for starting small and going I went the direction of a crowdfunding campaign, which gave me a lot more control on my cash flow and a lot more of a simplistic understanding of that cash flow. So once the campaign's over, the cash comes in, your customer's already expecting a delayed delivery of that. So as long as you have actually projected things correctly, you should theoretically be able to fulfill on that. And now you have a track record, history, credibility. These are things that carry weight with conventional financing. And once you have that under your belt, even if it's not the end game final product that you were working towards, you will be infinitely more likely to succeed in going that next step, attracting or convincing venture funding. There's just no end to the benefits of starting small and actually getting a product in the hands of customers by any means necessary.
So we are so lucky to be in this location where we have over 8,000 manufacturers, small and medium-sized manufacturers. And one of the things I always compare us to is sort of Detroit, where, when the auto industry went under, they had manufacturers who were much larger than many of ours, right? But they were very focused on that one industry, and most of them didn't have any other customers. And fortunately for us, even though in the 70s, Pittsburgh went through a downturn with steel and so on, a lot of the manufacturers were smaller mom and pop manufacturers, so they were able to find a customer or two to keep themselves going, and they are open to the idea of working with startups. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, especially when you find the right ones. It's really interesting to go out and meet some of these manufacturers who are on their second or third generation in the family, and so their parents or grandparents had a very traditional, larger scale operation. 80-90% of their business was one customer, and the ones that are still around, yeah, we had a lot of attrition whenever the steel industry collapsed, but the ones that are around still have become very accustomed to becoming diverse and pulling in new customers, entertaining new ideas. Also, they like making things, and so they enjoy working with people who have a new product, a new idea, something that they can get a handle on, that will challenge them, that be creative. It does largely come back to developing relationships, which is much easier done here than internationally. So that is one huge benefit to working within the region. And that's something that I'm responsible for within IW, is building out that network of manufacturers who not only have worked with us, but have worked with our portfolio companies, and pooling all of that resource and collective relationships together to make it more accessible to newer entrepreneurs.
And you run the Scalable Expo in the fall, right?
Yes, so we do the Scalable Expo twice a year, where we try to invite manufacturers from all over the region to come into Pittsburgh and to meet with entrepreneurs from both our portfolio and the community at large. So that way you can actually put a face to the name and get the introduction. Because trust me, whenever I was sending out requests for quotes for my product, I would send out 25 and get maybe 4 back. and you have to continuously follow up. And without a relationship, without an introduction or a face-to-face, it can be very difficult and frustrating. And especially whenever you put that in face of having everything ride on it, it makes it more likely that you're going to try to cut corners and accelerate things and not dedicate the appropriate time to building the relationships as you should. And it is a diverse industry that we have here, especially largely because of the universities that we have in this region and the way that the economy has diversified out of just pure steel. We have the energy sector, which is huge. There's also the electronics, the biomedical, education.
Tool and die.
Yeah, tool and die.
So really and truly, I think one of the reasons that we launched AlphaLab Gear and our hardware sector initiative here is because Pittsburgh people know how to make things. And if you think about where you might want to launch an app or a fintech business, I could understand, maybe fintech belongs in New York, or maybe if you're going to do entertainment industry or fashion, you might want to consider LA. But if you're making something physical, Pittsburgh really is the best place to launch a hardware company. We have experience with working with early stage products. We have manufacturers who are willing to work with startups. There are skilled workers here, and that is a real shortage across the country now. As more manufacturing is coming back to the US, this is the region where people are locating those facilities because we have the skilled workers.
And there's a lot of Pittsburgh pride in this region. So if you base your company out of here, you will be better received by the manufacturers that work in this region because they're loyal to this region.
So, I guess, should we talk a little bit?
Yeah, how are we doing on time?
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes. I think we talked a little bit about what we do in our accelerators. I think we've talked about the model and about AlphaLab and AlphaLab Gear. So maybe we'll leave the last 10 minutes or so. Do we have about 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Is that right? To answer questions, if anybody has any.
You guys mentioned a little while back about, some of the hidden costs by having components sourced out of China. You mentioned something about the U.S. that we have advanced manufacturing capabilities that they don't, for example. What do you define as advanced manufacturing, and how does that show up as a hidden benefit?
Yeah, so a lot.
The question was, we had mentioned earlier about hidden costs regarding scaling up and advanced manufacturing and how the U.S. has some advantages when it comes to advanced manufacturing over foreign manufacture. So
the U.S. government has restricted certain technologies so they can't be exported. And if you take a look at the really high-end manufacturing that happens here, so for defense, for some of the autonomous vehicles, for some of the robotics, for medical technology, most of that is still happening here just because the capabilities are stronger here. For so many years, and it makes sense what they did in China, for so many years what their big advantage was a lower labor cost. So if you've got a lower labor cost, it makes sense to take advantage of that, not to invest in very expensive technology, which you're going to have to replace soon. So from their standpoint, most of them wait and see with technology as opposed to adopting it early. And that is changing. It's gotten better. But just in general, their attitude is to wait and see with regard to that and see if it catches on and see if somebody else leapfrogs it and there's a new technology before they adopt it, and to sort of rely on what they're good at. And because we couldn't rely on that here, we just don't have the low labor costs, I think there's more of a feeling here where people are developing that technology and immediately implementing it.
Absolutely. One of the most tangible examples that I have from my experience is the cost and complexity of tooling. So if you're trying to make 1,000 parts, you can get away with having like a simple 2-part, 1-cavity mold, which can be made very cheap, and even more insanely cheap overseas where they're not necessarily tied to any sort of like ISO compliance regimens, where they are very finicky about specific surface finishes or things like that, US manufacturer will cause the prices of simple things like that to go up really high. But that type of a mold can't produce very large quantities in any reasonable amount of time. Not to mention, because of the labor costs in the US, they just won't do it. It doesn't make any sense for them. So the barrier to entry on tooling will go up higher to more complex and automated type tooling systems. So if you can float the cash flow for like a $100,000 tool, that's whenever you get back into the market of it makes a lot more sense to make things here, because you don't even have a human being pulling the parts out of the mold. The tooling is already designed for that degree of automation. And that's where a lot more of the US infrastructure has been investing in when it comes to manufacturing parts, because they recognize that labor, we just can't compete on that labor part of the price. So,
Appreciate it.
yeah.
The need to be familiar with the manufacturer, hopefully past experience. At AlphaLab, could you keep track of manufacturers that sort of earned your gold star and can help to recommend for other companies?
Yep. that is
That's the short answer.
yeah, that is 100% my job now.
And I'll
and
say-
Afshan before me.
Yeah,
so.
and I'll say also that we have an alumni network. So if you've got somebody that we haven't worked with yet, we can send out a letter to hundreds and hundreds of companies that we've invested in or that have been, that are part of our network, and get back honest feedback for you. And that's another advantage to letting the manufacturer know that you're part of the network or going through MAT, because they know that if they don't do a good job for you, we'll be talking to everybody. And honestly, that's what we did in Asia as well. It was really important, one of the things that was really great about working with a manufacturer that you did a lot of business with, they did not want to upset you because they could lose all their business. And so you get a little bit of that benefit from the network. Yeah. Good. Well, we'll be around if anybody has questions for the next couple minutes. And, if you have an idea for a physical product or you know somebody who does, we'd really like to encourage you to come and talk to us. We help even before you're ready to launch it, even when you're just thinking about it. And on the 28th of February, the Pittsburgh Regional Hardware Cup is going to be right here in this space at 6 in the evening, right? Mm-hmm. And you're going to see 6 or 7 companies from actually across the country, mostly from Pittsburgh, but it's a international competition, and so people can apply to pitch in whatever city they want, and Pittsburgh has been popular lately. So there will be companies from all over the place. There'll be 6 or 7 semifinalists and another 6 or 7 companies that we just select to display their product if they're not far enough along yet to really be an active competitor. There'll be 5 or 6 investor judges here judging them. You'll have a chance to ask questions and to see what some of the really cool physical product companies are doing.
And the winner from this competition will compete against the winner from all of our other domestic ones. So the major cities that we have, like Boston,
Boston, Atlanta, DC, Pittsburgh, Chicago, San Jose, Boulder, and that's it. And then we have, there will be international competitors from Israel, India, South Korea, Japan, China, and the Netherlands. Netherlands is all of Europe.
And so all of those winners will be coming back for an event later on, I think towards the summer.
May 15th, yeah.
May 15th, for like a grand prize.
And that'll also be here, because the AI Robotics Venture Fair is going to be here May 15th and 16th, and the International Finals of the Hardware Cup will be part of that program. So, great, thanks. Thanks so much.
Thank you guys.